to my people their rebellion, and to the house of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commandments of its God. They ask for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast that I have chosen? Only a day for man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fast I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide for the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, Here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with a pointing finger and malicious talk, and you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in the sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundation. You will be called Repair of Broken Walls and Restore of Straight Dwellings. Conditions that demanded the voices crying out, shouting aloud for restoration of true and pure religion. The challenge to raise the voice aloud was concerning the present religious conditions of Israel. Cry aloud, raise your voice like a trumpet against the sins of my people. Israel was a nation that was living in rebellion while traditionally proclaiming slogans and principles of righteousness. They were acting religious, but in reality, they were not keeping the commandments of God. They had a form of godliness in outward religious ceremony, but all the while denying its power to change their lives to complete conformity to the laws of God. They lacked the blessings of God upon their religious efforts because they had mixed religious observance with worldly-minded concepts and unspiritual lives. While outwardly appearing to be religious, even sacrificially submitted to God, their lives sacrificially submitted to God, their lives were really filled with injustice, oppression, and without any compassion and love. They even looked like they were sacrificing. He mentions their fasting. And he talks about the fact that they humbled themselves, even laying in sackcloth and ashes. And yet, he says, is this really the fast that I want? Is this the type of religion that I am concerned or interested in? Therefore, instead of triumphantly marching forward as a united people of God, there was quarreling, strife, and division among them. This was their lot, and God could not bless them. Only if they turned around and walked in His commandments faithfully, bringing their lives into conformity with the religious practice and observance that God commanded, only then could God really bless them. And He promised to bless them. And they would rebuild again the foundations that lay in ruin. History repeats itself, and the past must be continually recycled, and a people called out and returned to the firm foundations of God. Not only see this in Israel, you see it continually happening in history. This is such an oft-repeated cycle as to become an axiomatic truth. Axiomatic truth. Meaning one that is self-evident. Therefore, we should not think that God's people in America should be any different from those of past generations who have had the same struggles or similar struggles. This is the great controversy of God and Satan, the great warfare that began in the Garden of Eden and continues through the history of time until all of God's enemies become his footstool. Only then will the church walk triumphantly, eternally. Until then, we're going to be faced with these struggles, and we need to know what happened in the past, for we need to recycle that. We need to recognize the failures of the past and go on and move forward and lay again the foundations that are permanent and solid and godly. The history of division in the Lord's Church in America follows a pattern set deeply in the past. This was defined by David Edward Harold Jr. in his sequel to his first volume published, The Quest of a Christian America, the second volume entitled The Social Sources of Division in the Disciples of Christ, tracing the history of that movement between the years 1865 and 1900. He also refers to this in defining the division of the 1950s among the non-instrumental churches of Christ in a booklet entitled Emergence of the Church of Christ Denomination. Taking for its premise a sociological definition of these historical periods, he shows what sociologists term the sect to denomination process, and shows that this has taken place once and again in the history of the Restoration movement. What is this process that he's talking about? And by definition, then, the sociologists talk about the fact that all new and fervent religious groups emerge as what they would term sects. Now, what are the marks of a sect according to the sociologists' interpretation of the history of religious organizations? Well, first of all, one of the first marks is that they believe that they possess the truth. They're convinced that they possess the truth, and they want to stand by that truth. Another mark is that they practice a strict morality. They practice a strict morality. Thirdly, they believe themselves to be a part of the true church, or the true church, in their time. Fourthly, they possess a fervent spirit. They're very zealous and moving people, anxious to make their message known to the world because they're convinced that it is truth. By definition, by sociologists' definition, the New Testament church was a sect. In Acts chapter 28 and verse 22, when the Apostle Paul was in prison in Rome, you recall that the Jews came to Paul's private dwelling house, the rented house that he had, and this is what they had to say. They said, "But we desire to hear from you what your views are. For concerning this sect, it is known to us that it is spoken against everywhere." They looked at Christianity, the New Testament church that Jesus had established through the ministry of the apostles, as being a sect, because they were defining it by this concept, this sociological concept of which these people zealously were preaching and proclaiming the truth everywhere that they had gone. And so they said, "We know only this. We don't know much about it, but we know that everywhere, everyone's against it. because they took a unique position. Now, what is the denomination, according to the definition of the sociologist? Well, a denomination, he says, on the other hand, bears these characteristics. Number one, they become very tolerant of other churches. Very tolerant of other churches. Two, they accept the general moral standards of society. Rather than following a strict moral code, they simply go along with whatever society considers morally acceptable or right. They're less dogmatic in their stand and in their preaching. They are less active in their approach. In other words, less evangelistic. They are more interested in the world that is around them than in the standards of the past. By this, we would mean they are more society-oriented. They're more oriented to society and what is going on within society, and desirous of lifting up society's total concepts rather than building upon truth. Many groups have evolved from sect to denomination in status. And Edwin Harold and other historical sociologists will say that this has happened with most of the religious bodies that we see today. At one time they started out as a sect by definition, but as they became more mature, grew in numbers numerically, became numerically respected, it was not long until they drifted into the denominational pattern. Within many of these groups, of course, there is always a conservative element who refuse to go along with the trend that the religious organization is taking. You can see this around you in many areas. Some of the Stone movement, which refused to go into union with the element of the Campbellite Church, became what was known as the Old Christian Connection. And then later on, a group of those churches united with the Congregational Christian Church. And it became the Congregational Christian Church because of the union of the Christian Connection and the Congregationalist Church. But there were many of those churches that simply refused to go into that union because they saw in this a trend towards what they considered a more liberal denominational pattern. And so I remember when I was a boy, my father held some meetings for some churches over in the next county to us in Pennsylvania and down in Fulton County, Maryland, who were part of the Old Christian Connection, still existing, and still some of those churches exist today. But then the Congregational Church united some time back, and there were those who went into that union. Others refused to go into that union. So there are those who refuse to go along with the trend and cling to the old ways of their origin. They refuse to make the transition to a more liberalistic position and are eventually forced to separate when it takes on the denominational status. Finally, it points out that there is a middle ground that lies between this sect to denomination transition. And this middle ground, or middle group, refuses to make the entire transition from sect to denomination, though they change many of their ways to conform to more traditional views that have been espoused as the movement goes along. Why does this change come about? I would like to share with you then something that Edwin Harold says concerning the sect to denomination process. He says the sect to denomination process, which is so reoccurred in American religious history, is an easily explained phenomenon once these facts are understood. He has just set forth what I've told you in defining the sect and the denomination and the institutional sect, the middle ground. He says once you've understood this, then you can understand what has happened in American religious history. A religious group that begins as a fervent offspring of poor but honest people can change quite decisively in a few generations of time. The successful grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have far exceeded their forebears financially, educationally, and socially are not likely to want the same kind of worship, the same kind of preachers, or the same kind of gospel as their ancestors loved. What he's saying is that generally these sects have started out poor. You can see this in Pentecostalism today. It starts out poor with poor people, and then as the grandchildren and great-grandchildren come along, they're better off financially, better off economically, and educationally. And they're no longer satisfied with the old-time preachers and the old-time ways. They want something more modern. And so they change the church. The denomination is the type of religious expression that suits their sociological and psychological needs. All of this, he says, sounds rather deterministic. It clearly implies that only certain types of people are attracted to pure and fervent religion. Someone asked me a few months ago if I was saying in my book that if you were not poor, you could not be a Christian. A liberal church's of Christ historian accused me of saying that the only reason the conservative brethren rejected the instrument was because they were too poor to afford it. That is patently false. But what is true and what is easily demonstrated by historical scholarship is that the rich and the sophisticated tend to want a different kind of religion from the poor and humble. Of course, there are individual exceptions, nor does this deny that they all may act on honest convictions. But who can deny that the humble and the proud are apt to hold different convictions? The clear pattern is there. I said, this can even be established scripturally or from the Bible. In James chapter 2 and verse 5, we read these words, "Listen, my dear brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith, and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him?" And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians and said, "Brothers," verse 26, "think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth." Jesus himself said in Luke chapter 6 and verse 24 and 25, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied." Verse 20 and 21. And then in 24 and 25 he says, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry." And Jesus, when John's disciples came to inquire of Jesus, was he really the Christ? Among other things that Jesus said that they were to go back and inform John concerning was that the good news was preached to the poor. Did that mean that Jesus didn't preach to the rich? No, it meant that the poor were willing to accept what Jesus had to say, where the rich were much less willing to accept it. They wanted something different than what Jesus had to offer. The threefold division in the Restoration movement was based upon doctrinal issues, yes. We saw what some of those issues were: war, slavery, instrumental music. We didn't have time to discuss all, but you could include the pastor system in there. Biblical criticism, open membership, institutionalism. All of these things were issues upon which brethren were divided in the history of the Restoration movement as it progressed through the 19th century. But there was also social division, and this fact can likewise be demonstrated. And again, we'd like to share with you some statistical figures concerning the division between the non-instrumental churches of Christ and the balance of the movement. He says the schism of the Restoration movement in the 19th century was a division into sociological groups is a matter of simple fact. A study of the census returns makes this point obvious. According to the religious census of 1916, the disciples of Christ had a membership of 1,226,000, while the churches of Christ had only 317,000 members. It was more than 4 times the number in the rest of the movement than were in the churches of Christ at that time. Now, comparing this, he says, the former slave states, however, the disciples' membership totaled only 485,000, over half of which were in the border states of Kentucky and Missouri. On the other hand, nearly 250,000, that's better than 2/3, nearly 250,000 of the churches of Christ members were in the former slave states. In Tennessee, the disciples listed 21,500 members, while the Church of Christ claimed 63,500 members out of its total 317,000. So he's saying here were some divisions that were society-oriented according to the status of the people. And he goes on to point out concerning the liberal wing within the movement. But he says, on the other hand, the liberal wing in the church was strongly urban. It was led by preachers of the growing cities of the Midwest and Kentucky. Disciples in these areas had grown rich and fat in the 19th century. The liberal movement grew in almost a precise ratio to the growth of sophistication of the membership of the churches. In short, that element in the movement which was most respected, which was most receptive to progress, that element which first introduced the organ, which pushed for changes in the organizational structure of the church, which accepted the findings of modern scholarship, was the most economically and psychologically stable element in the church. By this meant they were well off. And, of course, you will always find exceptions to what is being said when he's talking about generalities here. And then he talks about the middle-of-the-roaders. He says those who were middle-of-the-roaders doctrinally represented an economic class somewhere between the extremes. The most notable doctrinal moderates were in Kentucky. The moderate movement got strong support from the neat and respectable rural churches in Kentucky and the Midwest. These churches were neither so economically depressed as those of the South, nor so sophisticated as the growing congregations in the cities. Neither was the doctrine they accepted so extreme as that of either of the other two groups. Then he says what happened was that the disciples of Christ had undergone the sect to denomination evolution. At least the segment of the movement had completed the transition. The growth had passed through the same transition common to all religious movements. 3 incompatible classes had emerged within the church. And he says, on the other hand, there remained in the church in 1900 a sociological class of fervent people who could only be satisfied with the same old vital, aggressive emphasis common to the founders of the movement. They refused to evolve into a denomination and retained the strict standards which fitted their emotional, religious needs. And then he says it is enough to simply point out that the peacemakers in the middle of the road were simply another sociological group. They made up a part of the transition to denominationalism but stopped short of the full process. Doctrinally, they reached a hybrid position of partially acceptance of denominational standards and partial retention of the old legalistic standards. In short, they became the institutional sect. And he's talking about the independent Christian church, which really developed out of that middle-of-the-road classification. And so we have the disciples of the Church of Christ, the Christian church, one representing the very liberal element, the other a very conservative element, and one that was kind of in the middle between the two, who only went half the way in the transition from sect to denomination. Now, the purpose of Carroll's writing this book is to interpret what is happening or was happening during the 1950s within the non-instrumental churches of Christ. to show that there was at that time emerging out of the movement a denominational standard among the Church of Christ. That many of them had departed from the concepts that they once held, and it moved over to much more liberal standards. And he says you can see the pattern, the cycle going from sect to denomination among these churches. We will look tonight at the independent Christian church, Churches of Christ, separation, that likewise took place around this particular time in the same view, or from the same view, as Harold takes of what happened on the other side. What was the state of the independent Christian churches, Churches of Christ, in the 1940s? I know from first-hand information as I was growing into manhood during this particular period of time. I can remember in the early or middle 40s, 1940s, after the Second World War, right at the end of the Second World War, when I really started to perk up 16 or 17 years old and began to think about what was going on around me in the world, that much of the preaching that was being done at that particular time within the independent Christian church was centered in the themes of modernism, against the United Christian Missionary Society, and the Disciples' Ecumenical Spirit. That among other schools, Cincinnati Bible Seminary was sending out preachers who could scathe the United Christian Missionary Society and the liberalism that stood within the church at the time. Their preaching was centered along these lines, as well as the ordinances of baptism and the Lord's Supper. These became really the only essentials to the preaching. You have to be baptized for the remission of sins, that is, immersed, and you partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, and these were the two essentials of the Christian church. Everything else was pretty much placed in the realm of liberty as far as their preaching was concerned. They lacked any real preaching on the subjects of worldliness, such as against dancing and the going to movies and smoking and the playing of cards and other forms of gambling. And we could mention many other things as well. They had made the transition halfway between and become an institutionalized sect in which they were trying to satisfy the social needs of the people and still maintain a standard of biblical teaching. Yet their preaching was not really fervent, nor was it oriented to really move people from the standards of the world to the standards of Jesus Christ. Their preaching lacked any real points to bring about real conversion. It was a matter of evangelistic emphasis, with the emphasis on believing in Christ and being immersed into Christ, but very little emphasis on a need for repentance before one was immersed into Jesus Christ. Church government was largely ignored. They had adopted the church board system, in which the preacher, along with elders and deacons and Bible school superintendents and the president of the Ladies' Aid possibly, and numerous chairmen of committees, would make up the official board of the church. And each had an equal vote. And oftentimes the number of deacons far outnumbered the number of elders. And even if the church board was solely made up of elders and deacons, the elders were always outvoted on almost every issue simply because they were in the minority. The election system was present among them. And the time when you came for the annual election was a time of politicking very much like you had in the world. I can remember times and churches where at election time you saw people in the church that you never seen the rest of the year. and particularly if their party was voted out of office. Then you never saw them until they had an opportunity to try to vote their party back in again. And it was just kind of a warfare that was continually carried on through that election process. They had the pastor system. Although they didn't call it by that term, they used minister with the capital N. He was the hireling of the congregation. And as long as he met their needs and their desires, they kept him. But if he stepped out of line, they merely fired him and hired another. And that practice is still pretty well true among the independent Christian churches. We mentioned the committee system. And as the churches were larger in number, more and more committees had to take care of whatever was involved and needed to be taken care of. And then there was the Ladies' Aid Society, which in many places actually ran the church. And you did not dare cross those ladies. There were those who engaged in union services with the denomination, and still do. It was common to have union meetings with the denominations of the community at Thanksgiving time and at Christmas, and perhaps a New Year's union meeting, watch night service, and sometimes at other special days. There were those who called themselves reverent, although others frowned upon the use of the term. There was a great deal of emphasis on special Sundays and special promotion days. The Standard seemed to have something going all the time in the way of some type of special promotion. A great deal of emphasis was laid upon Christmas, and I can remember as a child getting my candy treat on Christmas Sunday. A Christmas tree was placed at the front of the building, and one of the members, an elder or deacon or someone else, came in dressed up as Santa Claus and passed out the treats to the kids. Oh, that was a great time for the kids. But what place did Catholic saints have in the restoration of New Testament Christianity? Easter and even the practice of Lent, some places, Halloween, St. Valentine's Day, Rally Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, and you could just go on and go on and go on. It seemed like every day was somebody's day except the Lord's Day. These became common practices. There was a lack of faithfulness and emphasis upon faithfulness. There was little preaching concerning Bible study and the need for daily Bible study by Christians. There was little emphasis on the prayer meeting. I can remember many of these churches, and this is just as true today, many of them quit having prayer meetings, and the ones who still had them, you might have 150 people there on Sunday morning, about half that number on Sunday evening, and then when it came to the Wednesday night service, the prayer meeting, there may be just a handful of people that were there. About 10 or 12 or 18. And that was it. Because they didn't think about prayer. They didn't care about prayer. They didn't care about faithfulness. And as we mentioned, there was little conversion preaching. They were made up primarily of Sunday go-to-meeting Christians. And that Sunday morning, go-to-meeting Christians. It was this type of lethargy and lack of biblical emphasis that led in those war years, the years of the Second World War, to many rising up in objection to what they saw around them. In the West Coast, Archie Word, having been converted from a worldly life, gave his all to God and began holding revival meetings across the country, emphasizing spirituality and a need for churches to quit playing church and get down to business. O.L. Mankemeyer was one of the early leaders in the East who likewise had printed many tracts. I can still remember the one entitled The Most Important Blood Transfusion in the World. And in that tract he set forth the need for the Lord's Supper from a biblical standpoint. Not just a person comes and takes a little unleavened loaf and drinks juice from a cup, but there is a communion and a fellowship with Jesus Christ in his body and blood that is associated with that, and need to be faithful in those things. There was preaching against the use of tobacco by O.L. McNamara and going to the movies. I can still remember in the later 40s, when I first moved to Winchester, Virginia after graduating from high school, that Harold Buckles held a revival meeting there for us. That had been the previous year. I believe O.L. McNamara was there. The year before that, Archie Word had held a 4-week revival meeting. The year before that, Donald Hunt had held a 3-week revival meeting there. I wasn't there in those days, but I came during the meeting and was there when O.L. McNamara held his meeting, and that was followed by a meeting by Harold Buckles, in which we saw some things and heard some things that we'd never seen or heard before. I can remember on one occasion preaching so strongly against denominationalism that he had gone down to a second-hand store. In those days, you could buy these wash bowl and pitcher sets dirt cheap. People didn't consider them antiques. He bought one of those wash bowls, and he talked about sprinkling. He just took that wash bowl and broke it right over the top of the pulpit. He got his point across, though. There was a couple things that he did that the people were kind of upset about. He jumped up on the piano once and began preaching off the piano and then down on the piano stool, and people just hadn't seen anything like that before. But I hadn't seen 25 or 26 people come forward to repent of going to the movies before either. But they did. They came then because the preaching was strong, and the desire was to get people out of the world and into Jesus Christ. And some of these brethren simply took some of these old, weak, insipid Christian churches and overnight changed the whole congregation around. The whole tenor of the preaching and desire for godliness became the rule of the day. A tent meeting was held here in Ottumwa in those middle 40s by Archie Word, and as a result of that, Midwestern School was established. James McMorrow, Donald Hunt, later joined up with Burton Barber as a student down there in Ozark Bible College, and they came out preaching a revivalistic message and a need to return to pure New Testament Christianity. The Voice of Evangelism began to be published in 1946, and it was full of in those early days with articles that just breathed fire every one of those papers that you picked up. When I first went off to school in 1950, Nathan Williamson, the preacher at the Loudon Street Church of Christ, then in Winchester, Virginia, handed me a stack of Voice of Evangelism back issues and said, take these to school with you. When you may find some fellows you can give those to. Well, the school that I went to was in the East, and I soon discovered that the school contained a lot of unspiritual people, including most of the instructors and the president of the college. It was not long until I found myself on one side and they were on the other. And I don't know what would have happened to me in those years if I had not had that stack of old voices that I could have turned to and found there preaching that I said, look, I can read about things like that in the Bible. And I know that people who preach and teach like that must be from God. There were the early days of rallies. Surprisingly, some of those rallies are beginning right there in a little town of Cincinnati, Iowa. Just a country town, hardly a blip on the map. And yet people came. I came to Cincinnati, Iowa, the whole way from Virginia in those early years. And I was excited about what I saw and heard. Not only was the preaching great, but I can remember the first morning that I woke up getting ready to go to the rally. In those days, I always had a prayer service before the rally station began. If you were someplace where the rally was, then you gathered together maybe in that locality for a prayer meeting. And I had never seen the whole church get down on its knees before and pray. But that happened there. And I was convinced these people must mean business then. If they're willing to get down on their knees and pray, I'd always heard people complaining that they couldn't do that. But I saw old people as well as young people on their knees praying to God. and fervently praying to God, and people that weren't afraid to say amen, and when people said amen, everybody didn't turn around and look at you like you were some Pentecostal, you're kind of crazy in the head. There was something there that was good. I listened to the singing at the rally, and I said, it must be the songbook. I've never heard singing like this before. And so I went up and bought one of those stamped Baxter books and took it home. Well, I could say, well, we want to sing these songs back home because they have some spirit in it. But I found that the spirit was really in the people. It wasn't in the songbook. That was the people meant business for God, and the singing was good. It was a different ball game on a different day. As men began to take a hold of that across the country, they soon found out that there was a great deal of opposition. I was against those who took that particular stand. First of all, we were accused of preaching opinions. You left the fundamental elements of the gospel when you get beyond baptism and the Lord's Supper and fighting to use the mess. And so anything else was a preaching of opinions. Because men dare stand up and name sin by first names, they simply said, well, you're opinionated and you're preaching your opinion. And they began to ridicule you and say you belong to the holiness church of Christ. Remember those terms? I remember one Christian church preacher getting me aside like a admonishing father and sitting on the swing with me on a cool summer evening and telling me, look, those fellows out there have a lot of way out ideas. You ought to know about some of those things before you get wrapped up with people like that. You know that all of those students out there have to use Hunt's ketchup? They can't use any other kind? Do you realize that Archie Word won't allow any of the women in his church to wear nylon? They have to wear black socks or hose or whatever, you know. Do you know that women can't wear high-heeled shoes? It was this type of thing. And after each time he told me something like that, I said, how did you know? Well, I've been told. And I come to find out that most of those fellows had been told in their Christian church Bible college. Because that was way out, you see. Then came the issue of the television. Then we became the no TV church. The no TV church. Oh, you don't want to get tangled up with those people. They really hate women. They won't let women talk. They won't let women pray. Why, they would just, it was odd though, because all of us were still marrying women. It was an odd kind of situation. And got some pretty good wives out of the bargain. All those Ottumwaites, you want to stay away from them. They're a separate way. They finally simply chose to ignore and go the separate way. They did not list the School of Evangelists out in Portland, nor the Midwestern School of Evangelism among the Bible colleges. Voice was, many dropped their subscriptions and ceased to subscribe, and some of the early fire eaters fell by the wayside because the going just got too rough. Who was right? Who had forsaken the mainstream of the movement? And who had been excluded? I want to share some things with you concerning the old paths within the church that I think are kind of eye-opening. Until Edwin Harold made a sociological study of the movement, I had never seen information like this available before. But first of all, we want to consider the earliest period of the Restoration movement, beginning in about the year 1800 and through 1865. And if you remember, some of the first messages that we preached in this series, we pointed out the Revolutionary War had left this country in a terrible moral condition. That drinking was so prevalent that it was not a shame or an unusual thing to find the preachers of the churches drunk. These are denominational churches at the time. Now listen to this. From all accounts, the average American at the turn of the 19th century was a prodigious consumer of spirits. It has been estimated that in the year 1823, the yearly consumption of liquor in the United States amounted to 7.5 gallons per person. I don't know how that compares with modern day, but it sounds like it compares pretty well. During the early years of the century, most American churchmen offered little protest against drinking. As a matter of fact, many clergymen shared the taste of their parishioners, parishioners for stimulating beverages. They were perishing. While this attitude began to change quite markedly by the year 1830, many American church leaders retained a moderate and a tolerant attitude towards temperance drinking throughout the first half of the 19th century. Thomas W. Caskey, which we have mentioned before, during the Civil War, the message on the Civil War, was a pioneer preacher who was considered a storyteller extraordinary. And he relates this story concerning the annual revival of a church. Two prominent church members who had been to market to lay in their supplies for the annual revival of their church held the following conversation on their journey home. How much spirits did you get? 10 gallons. Just such stinginess as that will spoil the meeting and kill the church. I got 20 gallons myself, and you are just as able to support the gospel as I am, if you wasn't so dog stingy. I said that might be an apocryphal story, but it kind of illustrates the spirit of the times in those very early years. However, it was not long until the church was in opposition against old demon rum. We're told that after 1840, apologies for moderate drinking virtually ceased among the disciples' publications, but the fervent protest of temperance leaders within the church furnished vivid evidence that many disciples, including some of the preachers, retained their earlier tastes. One Kentucky temperance advocate woefully wrote, "In our village we have the singular spectacle of a brother building a meeting house at the top of a hill and working in a whiskey still at the bottom of it." Of course, some of those churches were located in Bourbon County, Kentucky. By the middle of the decades of the 1820s, the hard drinking habits of the nation began to come under heavy attack from a growing group of reformers. There were crusades formed in the 40s, one known as the Washingtonians or the Sons of Temperance. The first major breakthrough in temperance legislation was passed by the state of Maine, a Prohibition Act in the year 1846. And of course, several other states followed suit, but the Civil War came along. And you know what war does. And so those early prohibition laws in the past by the states were simply allowed to die during the period of the Civil War. And after that, it was another battle that had to be waged. But in the year 1833, Walter Scott warned professed Christians who manufactured and used whiskey that surely the darkness of your damnation will increase tenfold if you reform not from such unholy doings. In the same year, John T. Johnson launched a crusade for total abstinence in the Christian Messenger, and by the year 1840, every paper in the movement was firmly committed to this position. Alexander Campbell caustically replied in answer to a query concerning an action taken against a brother who drank and sold spirits of brandy. If on remonstrance and admonition he does not reform, put him away from the church. By the year 1865, total abstinence was being preached among all the churches. He says, in short, the disciples of Christ were never completely united on the liquor problem in the years before 1865, but increasingly they came to support the temperance movement or effort. And much of the division was not over the fact of the need for temperance and a need for abstinence from liquor, but over the fact of whether Christians ought to join temperance societies and to advocate temperance, or whether they should do this simply through the church. Much of that division was over that, and he mentions that a little later on. We don't have time to go into that. What about tobacco? What was the position that they took on tobacco? Jacob Creeth Jr. and John Rogers were some of the very early men, early pioneer preachers who came out firmly against the use of tobacco by Christians. Jacob Creeth Jr. wrote, "The filthy practice of chewing tobacco and spitting on floors is bad enough for the Jews and Turks, for Negroes and rowdies, but it's worse in Christian men. Still worse in Christian preachers, but worst of all in Christian women." In spite of such heated attacks and admonitions from their brethren, however, many disciples continued to use tobacco, and the matter was never considered serious enough to demand discipline in these early days. You see, this country had grown up on its first crop being tobacco, and it was introduced to the Englishmen by the Indians when he came to this country. It was a new and a fad thing. One writer vividly described the discomforts of non-chewers. "A single tobacco chewer in a seat may put all the rest to a serious inconvenience. The fumes arise from his ejected saliva, offending at least one sense, and the little pools which he forms around him are highly detrimental to those who have any regard for the cleanliness of their garments. In such cases it is altogether out of the power of the worshiper to kneel, and the effluvium which his lips may leave in the wine cup during the celebration of the Lord's Supper may be anything but agreeable to some of his weaker brethren and sisters." They all took communion out of one cup in those days. I said, we don't like to drink after those old tobacco chewers. John Rogers was one of those fellows who lifted his voice in those early days. Once he preached, his son in his biography says, once he preached in a town, and he names it, against common sins or vices. He spoke of money thrown away for tobacco. Not only so, the habit was filthy, sustained, it is true, by one and only one passage of Scripture. Let him that is filthy be filthy still. While enlarging upon the evil attending its use, he noticed that 2 or 3 brethren occupying the front seats were very restless. At last they could stand it no longer, but concluded to offer him a direct insult by spurting their filth on the naked floor and toward him. These men were never anxious to hear another philippic against common sins, nor was he very much inclined to preach soon again in that part of the Lord's vineyard. The old boy just couldn't spit because the preacher was on to their habit in his preaching. They finally couldn't take it any longer, so they took it out on him. They tried to spit right between his feet. Can you imagine? And that's the way it was. And on the West, preachers began to lift up their voice against sin because the hard-fighting Westerner liked his religion hard too. And he soon came to accept the teachings against worldliness, whether demon rum or tobacco or worldly amusements. It says the expanse of worldly allurements which came under the disapproving scrutiny of the disciple leaders during these years was enormous. Virtually every facet of the private life of the church member was subject to congregational investigation. The struggle to keep the saints unspotted from the world was nowhere more heated than in the area of entertainment. Balls, masquerades, routs, grand levees, sumptuous dinners, theater-going, gamblings, cards, dice, cockfights, horse races, puppet shows, checkers, backgammon, novels, fairs, parties, and other such frivolities all received attention from the moral guardians of the West. Of course, we have to recognize some of these things in the light of what they were. and where they were held and what was being portrayed and done. I'm sure that's the context in which he mentions the puppet shows. And I thought that was kind of amusing. They didn't fail to lift up their voice. In 1831, Barton W. Stone was preaching against dancing. He warned that all the fashionable amusements of the world, dancing stands preeminent to captivate the mind and destroy all serious and religious impressions upon the heart. Theater going also came under the ban. He says theater going, which was never a practical problem of any consequence for the Western disciples, simply because there wasn't that many theaters, I imagine, was universally condemned by the leaders of the movement and was occasionally the cause of excommunication. And then he goes on to talk about gambling and swearing. And as we mentioned in the quote just a few moments ago, the reading of silly novels by the ladies of the congregations. I guess these were the kind of soap operas of the day that many had gotten involved in, and they were admonished to read more serious things and give attention to their spiritual lives. Adornment came in for coverage by these brethren also, and we're talking about the period between 1800 and the Civil War. The women of the church were frequently cautioned about the evils of fashionable dress. Rib bands, rings, bracelets, hoop sleeves, and any number of other articles of adornment were denounced by the church leaders. Barton Stone complained that the taste of many women kept their husbands in perfect drudgery to support them. Another writer reported that the adornment of the contemporary ladies was such that the passions of men should be excited and their principles shaken. The symptoms of the lower class prejudice were everywhere apparent in the remonstrances of the disciples' leaders against costly array. Barton Stone chastised the female sisters for their servile imitation of the fashionables of Europe. And so it went. Home, marriage, and divorce likewise came under the scrutiny of these early preachers. But when we come to the middle period, we do find some things different, but not too different. Entering the Prohibition era, that is the agitation for outright prohibition in the country, we entered the era between 1865 and 1900. The Civil War had again lowered the moral standards of the country, and many preachers, recognizing and realizing this, said we've got to get rid of the evil of drink in this country once and for all. And so they set about on a battle, and even the ladies got together in the country and formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union somewhere around, I believe, 1874. I'm not certain on the date, though. By 1878, all of the disciples were preaching temperance. Many of the disciples were involved in temperance movements. I remember my own mother was very much involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as it's called, as WCTU. In many other areas, this discipline of church members were being relaxed on many of the issues of worldliness that have been preached against. Prior to the war, there was nothing to bring a person under investigation, and if they did not repent of their worldly attitude, they were cast forth from the church, or they withdrew their fellowship from them. But by now, with the liberalism creeping in many elements, discipline all but disappeared from the movement, and we're still suffering the effects of that today. You don't see churches disciplining. Simply, it's one of those things that needs to be restored that hasn't been restored. But then, worldliness likewise come under the examination of many of these men. I would just like to share a few things from this period with you at this time. Isaac Errett wrote in 1887, "We intend to fight the spirit of worldliness as one of the greatest foes to spiritual progress. But we insist on such a separation of the church from the world as shall bring the whole moral power of the church to bear unmistakably against card-playing, theater-going, dancing, patronage of the opera, church fairs, lotteries, grab bags, rafflings, and the such like." And this came from one of the weaker men. within the movement. In American Christian Review, nearly all the disciples agreed that all recreation was a part of a dangerous progression to the wrong end. One of the assistant editor of the American Christian Review outlined this danger when he says, first, it may start out as a social party, and then social and play party, and then croquet party, then picnic and croquet party, then picnic, croquet, and dance, absence from church, imprudent and immoral conduct, exclusion from church, a runaway match, well, that is two kids running away and getting married because they had to, poverty and discontent, shame and disgrace, and then final ruin. What they were saying was that many who had switched over to worldly concepts found themselves drifting further and further into sin. The Gospel Advocate in the year 1899, J.C. McQuitty, an assistant editor, urged the churches to carefully maintain church discipline and let people understand that if they wanted cards, balls, and theaters, they must disassociate themselves from our churches. He added his minimal fact that we are greatly lacking in this particular, that is, in discipline and really what needed to be preached. Strong stands were being maintained, however, in many quarters against many of those things that we've already mentioned. David Lipscomb wrote concerning dancing, its chief attraction arises from the close contact of the sexes and the excitement of the sensual feelings. If this were not true, men would be as fond of dancing with men as with women, yet you could arouse no interest in the dance confined to either sex. In other words, he said if women had to dance with women or men with men, you couldn't get them interested in that. And that was written back in the year 1884. Some of the same principles we preach concerning the dance. Likewise, with regard to the theater, they had this to say. In 1883, a young associate editor of the Gospel Advocate said that such entertainment excites evil passion and that those who enjoy life most do not attend such places. He was talking about the theater at the time, which had many graphic, he says, descriptions of evil associated with it. With regard to the circus, there were some preachers that spoke out especially concerning the immodesty of some of the circus performers. One preacher said concerning the costume of the lady who rode on horseback that the costume hesitated to begin and ended almost immediately. That was pretty good. It says it hesitated to begin and then it ended almost immediately. Spectator sports likewise came under the preaching and scrutiny of the preachers, especially because of the gambling that was associated with many of them, and then the brutality that was associated with boxing. And then, of course, because many of these spectator sports were taking place on Sunday, and people were staying away from church to go to these games, and of course, they preached against that. There were many other things, of course, that came under scrutiny at that particular time. We just would not have time to involve ourselves in reading all of this material, but it is really good. I found it good. I found it informative. They did have this to say about tobacco, though. It says, second to drinking, the personal habit most distasteful to disciples' leaders was the use of tobacco. And he gives some things of the objections that were raised. The most common single objection to the use of tobacco was that it was unhealthy. One preacher asserted that tobacco was the cause of 40 diseases, including delirium tremens. Jacob Creech Jr. wrote, the injurious effects of tobacco are seen in its causing vomiting, purging, universal trembling, staggering, convulsions, languor, feebleness, relaxation of the muscles, great anxiety of mind, and the tendency to faint and blindness. I don't know where he got all his facts, but at least he was against it. That was quite obvious. The most common objection to the use of tobacco was simply that the habit was a filthy habit. In a crude but typical text, Daniel Summer wrote, "But its filthiness and offensiveness to others place it under constant contempt. I would sooner handle a man's vomit than his tobacco juice, and would as soon smell a cesspool as his tobacco smoke and breath." Thousands who read those lines, he says, thousands who read these lines will confess the same. But of course, on the other hand, John Rowe and Isaac Garrett were tobacco users. And it was Daniel Summer's position that Isaac Garrett had ruined his health by smoking cigars. And this was the reason that he had to take his trip abroad to Jerusalem. It had just gotten him down. But strong stands were taken by these men. Oh yeah, we wanted to share one more. We have some time left on that tape? Okay. Concerning a modesty of dress, in the year 1885, an annoyed preacher wrote that women in his community did not hesitate to go into the ballroom and dance in close embrace with gentlemen with the upper portions of their persons exposed nearly to their waists, some more than others, much depending on the plumpness or the development of the parts exposed. Nor did they hesitate to go to the skating rinks and expose their lower extremities in a shameful manner. He says it is time to call a halt. Such a modesty of dress. Now, I think the reason for taking the time to read all of these comments is to show you that in the effort that we have been putting forth over the last 30 or 35 years, we're not a bunch of kooks. That preachers who stood for truth in the past stood against the sins of the world. Though now they have tried to make us out as being that, the present movement in its 35 years of existence should continue to seek those old paths rather than progress from sect to denominational status. And I see some danger on the horizon. There seems to be among the church today a real desire to make television a part of our lives. In one form or another, it is creeping in. I've been told by brethren that many churches now have a majority of people who have television in their homes. I think that there's a lack of preaching on the subject. And you don't hear near as much preaching as you once heard. I heard one preacher remark that it was a forgotten subject. I read not too long ago in a publication that is circulated among the churches that TV fell in the same class with instrumental music, and that this really wasn't preaching the gospel, that what we needed to do was get busy and win souls by spreading the gospel and teaching faith in Jesus Christ. Words to that effect. I wonder if we're not really encouraging this trend when we seek to use television in evangelism and church instruction. When the television set or monitor is brought into the church house and used to show videotapes of religious programming, will not Christians then say, you control its environment there, why can't I control its environment in my home? I see a tendency towards gimmick evangelism. I can remember Archie Word on more than one occasion preaching against the use of claptrap methods that have been found among the Christian churches. Whether in revival meetings or in the work of the church in evangelizing the lost, Many of those methods led to a worldly attitude within the church. I'm not saying all, or that all methods or all new methods are necessarily wrong, but I think it can show a trend in the years to come when there is an overemphasis on a need for evangelism that will lead to the baptizing of unconverted members and make worldly churches. I've seen this happen before. It's happened in the Restoration movement. The emphasis upon converting and building. And that emphasis is not wrong. Don't get me wrong. I believe that that's the work of the church and the need of the church and the need of the hour. But we need to be careful that we do not lower the standards of God just for the sake of adding up baptism and filling buildings. And I'm afraid that I see this trend going on. Personality cults are built on enthusiastic preachers who are continually breaking records and moving on to bigger and better things. But people oftentimes in such an environment are not converted to Christ, they're converted to the preacher. And that anyone else who does not have that same fervent, outgoing spirit, who can really excite and motivate everybody and get everybody just jumping all the time, he's doing something wrong. There's something the matter with that fellow. Just that other fellow that really knows how to go about it, you see. And that's the wrong spirit, because people differ in life. They differ in makeup. Some preachers preach one way, other preachers preach another. But if they're preaching truth, it doesn't matter so much about the personality behind the delivery. We're being converted to Christ, and we need to be converted to Christ, not for the preacher. And I see some dangerous trends in the institutional concepts that are present among us. The Bible college idea has not really died out among us, even though much of it has been scattered abroad into the congregational environment. And yet we hear continually the concept of the Bible college idea even in such atmospheres. Brethren, I read about the church in the Bible as being the institution that Christ gave to not only proclaim the words of the world, but to edify and strengthen the disciples of Christ. We can have special classes within the church to do that, and special intent to bring men and raise them up to be leaders within the congregation. And when you ship that off to an area of training, then you've destroyed the concept, the biblical concept, I believe, of the church. I really believe that ought to move out of the way. We talked about that in the early days as being the scaffolding that was necessary until we got the thing really going and moving the way that it wants to be. But that seems to be the permanent order of the day, rather than the scaffolding. And you see some signs of national organization, even among us. I've never been to a nationwide youth roundup. I understand that much good has been done at Denver at the nationwide youth roundup. But I was disappointed to see when they incorporated that thing as an incorporation. It is just such things that in time, allowed time and sufficient space, and thinking of people, that national organizations have their setups. I'm bothered about the need to educate our children in a Christian environment. I'm as concerned as any other parent over the fact that our public school system is full of many things that are not only not desirable for Christian young people and children growing up and being educated, but are certainly detrimental to their education and their Christian principles. I feel for any young person today going through the public school systems of our nation. And many have gotten on the bandwagon and said, well, let's establish schools, Christian schools, where where our children can be trained in a Christian environment. And I say, man, that's good. But then I look at the past and see what has happened with relationship to many things like this. And I can see that many of this develops, much of this kind of thinking often develops into demand for an institutionalized church. We have schools, therefore we have to have gyms or dorms or kitchens or whatever that need to be to take care of all of that. And the church becomes a vast and big thing, and bigger buildings must be built to take care of all of that. And we came along with the fact that the ACE program was a good program, and yet I got an application to the ACE program and read that application that I was expected to sign as the preacher of the congregation to establish such a school, and I said after reading it, I could not sign that document. It says that I must believe in a Baptist creed, in a creed of faith only, grace only salvation. And I don't believe that. I don't believe the Bible teaches salvation by grace alone and by faith alone. Therefore, I find it difficult to comprehend how brethren may have or must have signed that document. I have heard some explain it on the basis we know what we believe concerning these matters. But brethren, I just have to send that document back and tell them, look, I can't sign it unless you revise it along these lines. And I doubt very seriously that they would be very immoral to revising that thing. That's their statement of faith. Secondly, I'm upset over the political involvement of the ACE program. It was established by John Birch-oriented people and promotes a politicalism within the church. Now, I know that many of our Christian brethren, where these schools have been recognized, recognize this element and say, well, we simply skip some of that in the material that we teach. But others wear the red, white, and blue uniform and back the super patriotism that is inbuilt within the program. And I just don't find that that's what Christians ought to be involved in. Thirdly, there's the organizational aspect. When I read the Bible, I read about the church, and I read about Christians who had families, and I read about the fact that there was a family responsibility that every family had to train up their children in the way that they ought to go. But that was not a church responsibility. That was a family responsibility. I had one preacher tell me not long ago to that objection, well, you can't make that division. What is the church but the family of God? But the Bible makes that division. It talks about those who have widows relieving their widows. They're their family members and taking care of them, separate and apart, so the church will not be burdened. But I find a lot of churches being burdened today and spending all of their money to support a school system that should be going for the evangelistic effort of the church. Some call that the evangelistic effort. But that concerns me. That concerns me because I think it would be right, it would be the right approach for Christians, individual Christians, to get together and establish a school as an organization separate and apart from the church for the teaching and instruction of children by Christian people. And I think that's right. But I have trouble finding that the church did that in New Testament times as a body of people. I see a weakening stand towards the Christian church and a desire to have a broader appeal for our message and our influence. I've seen this coming quite a while ago when some of the singing groups not only were moving among us, but they got invitations to move among the Christian churches. We had some of those singing groups out in West Virginia, and I asked one of them in particular, what about this? I know some of the brethren who refuse to have you sing because you're singing among the Christian churches. And it was all based upon the fact of two things. One, we could not support we think we've broken down a lot of the prejudice against us by going among these people. I found the same thing is taking place with preachers out in New England who could not gain sufficient support for themselves and decided, in order to have that support, to move out among the independent Christian churches and seek the support wherever they could find it. I never have been partial to that. I worked many years at a secular job because I could not see that it would be any more justified to go to a Christian church who didn't believe what I preached and practiced, and to go to a Methodist church who didn't believe what I preached and practiced. On the one hand, it might be a question of what I preached or believed about baptism. On the other hand, it would be probably a question about what I preached and practiced concerning church organization and worldly, or Christian living or worldly living. I've seen this, of course, in the involvement of teaching programs created in sponsorship of Christian church people. And I'm concerned about that. This will lead to not only a broader appeal to our message, but a weakening of our message. I hope these thoughts have been profitable to you. I'm not discouraged, and I don't mean by bringing out all of this information to end on a discouraging word, because I don't feel that way when I study this history. But I just know that this is serious business. And when you look at the past and see that cycle taking place over and over and over again, you can even look back to the days of Israel and see that when they came out of Egypt, they were all gung-ho to serve God and to flee the slavery of Egypt. But it was not too long after that that they were pleading with Moses to return, that we might eat the leeks and the garlic of Egypt. They were missing some of the things that they had enjoyed in their former life. As they entered the promised land, they were all ready to clear out all of those people and drive them out of the land just as God had commanded them to do. But no sooner had they put their hand to that effort than they were crying out to Samuel the prophet and saying, "Give us a king like the other nations around us," because they were not satisfied with the plan and program that God had for them. God says, "They have not rejected you, Samuel. They have rejected me." We see that in the New Testament church as the apostles went forth and as the Christians were scattered abroad everywhere preaching the word. A sect spoken against, a people that were turning the world upside down. But it was not right there in the days of those apostles we began to see that cycle taking place. And as John writes his epistles, it's very apparent that many were willing to go off and follow after teachers who no longer believed in the truth concerning Jesus Christ as the Son of God. We see it in the Galatian letter when Paul wrote to those churches up in the provinces of Galatia and said, "I fear lest some of you have believed another gospel, which there's really not another. But if any man come and preach another gospel, yea, even the angels of heaven, let him be accursed." For he knew that there was really only one message by which they could live. I came out of the Christian church. I preach on this subject because I can trace my ancestors back on both my father and my mother's side as having been a part of the Restoration movement as long as I can trace. My great-grandfather lived in the Valley of Virginia, and on Alexander Campbell's trips through Morristown, Virginia, and into the valley, the upper valley of Virginia, going down, as we would think of it, he stayed in my great-grandfather's home. My grandfather a medical doctor in Hampshire County, Virginia, where I was born. In fact, I was born in his living room. He delivered me. Being the man who, with his sons, planed the lumber and built one of the first churches of Christ in that county. A little later, he moved into the town of Romney and opened up his practice there, moving from his orchard and farm at Pleasant Dale, West Virginia. There, he donated the land on which the Church of Christ was built in Romney, West Virginia. In later years, they refused to allow me to stand in the pulpit of that church building because I was against the Disciples of Christ and the program of the United Christian Missionary Society. My father was a graduate of Hiram College and the early schools, the Restoration Movement near Cleveland, Ohio. He was born in Wood County, Ohio. He grew up in the church, his father having married my father's father, my grandfather on my father's side, having married his school teacher, converting her from the Methodist Church to the position of Christian only. My father attended there, went on to preach after 1912 in Indiana and in eastern Ohio, and then became the state evangelist for the Valley of Virginia under the auspices of the United Christian Missionary Society in the year 1916. He worked in that capacity until about 1918, about the end of the First World War. And he resigned and then began as the state evangelist for the state of West Virginia under the auspices of the United Christian Missionary Society. In the year 1924 or 23, my father got up at the state convention and showed how the churches were losing hundreds of members because they had departed from the preaching of previous years. And he began to introduce liberalism and modernism, so much so that he said he could no longer function as the state evangelist in the United Christian Missionary Society. He resigned there, left that organization, and from that time onward to the end of the 20s,